Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 22nd week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. On Memorial Day, while carrying on what has been called the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, his drone program, President Obama produced even more remarkable lies about his killing. Even after all these years, I'm astonished at the sorts of things we get from this, and with very little comment in the media. He made a speech saying that this Memorial Day is the first in 14 years without major U.S. war. Now, critics and social media users and so forth immediately pointed out that this was a flat lie, saying the U.S. remains involved in military conflicts and proxy wars around the world, including at least 2 more wars than George Bush was involved in. But most Americans are unaware, and the president is playing on this, that he is making war in 8 countries around the world: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of the UN Charter, which forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. And even the ISIS campaign, of course, has never even been mentioned in the Security Council on the part of the U.S., although the Council has tried to consider it. Most Americans are unaware that the president is sending American death squads, we call them Special Operations Forces, into more than 100 countries around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. We're unaware that the president is conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drones, which has already killed thousands, including American citizens and hundreds of children. And we're unaware that the president was recklessly provoking war with Russia in Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, more than U.S. client Israel killed in Gaza last year. Why Obama lies is clear from his earliest political writings. His 2006 book, Audacity of Hope, which discussed the history of America's war in Vietnam, and the fact that the American people have stopped both parties from committing war crimes in Vietnam. 45 years ago, a large majority of Americans concluded that the U.S. war in Vietnam was not just a mistake, it was a crime, and young men drafted into the Army refused to fight. In fact, the Obama administration today is committing murder around the world, but pretending that they aren't, in order to mislead the only enemy they really fear, the American people, who drove 2 presidents from office during the Vietnam War. And the government is helped in this deception by compliant, big business-run media, so Americans know far less about what's going on than citizens of other countries. Obama's wars today are not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who forego government services and are taxed to pay for them, to the point that the U.S. is the most unequal developed country and is becoming more so at an increasing rate. But the wars are in the interest of a very few Americans, the very rich, the 1%, who profit enormously from American control of the world economy. The Obama administration is killing people around the world, but notably in MENA, as the Pentagon calls the Mideast and North Africa, and Eurasia, which contain energy supplies, oil and gas, that the U.S. government intends to control. U.S. control over world energy flows gives it leverage over our economic rivals from Germany to China. Control of, not just access to, gas and oil is what the U.S. demands, and our government has been willing to kill a lot of people to guarantee it. Wars conducted by U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Obama was elected on a platform of hope and change, but he's brought little hope and almost no change to U.S. war policy, except perhaps to lie more successfully about what he was doing than George Bush did. His policies are not different, but even more murderous. It's no wonder that the U.S. is hated around the world, as a candid article in the New York Times pointed out last week. Champaign-Urbana AWARE recommends you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them to stop killing people around the world and to bring U.S. troops home. The AWARE web page and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis, and also for members of our state legislature for reasons we'll talk about a little later tonight. Tonight in general, we'll talk about U.S. war making, which the government and media aren't talking about, with commentaries by Karen Aram on the pivot to Asia and Ron Szoke on I Hear America Moaning. And we'll start with Ron with that.
Yes, well, this is a slight variation on Walt Whitman's I Hear America Singing, because what I hear is not rightly called singing, I think, but a lot of moaning, bitching, whining about being victimized by various people and groups. And at some point, I typically feel like saying, as I said a couple of weeks ago, embrace the suck, because what you're saying and all the moaning is not really going to help matters any. And think about your decisions, especially when you're voting. But that's a hard message to put across. The current fashion is to try to figure out why we went to war with Iraq. Why did we invade Iraq? A number of hypotheses have been offered, and I think I said something about this last week. Is it something that was deeply personal with the president and his top advisors? Some people think that, because there's no rational basis for what he did. There was the myth of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was used to justify it. Indeed, we got a version of what some calling the Bush doctrine, that if you feel threatened and feel unsafe, then you're justified in attacking and taking out those people who are making you have these bad feelings. So there is a macro version of this played out on the international stage by the USA, because these supposed weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be entirely mythical, made us feel threatened. And so it was our right then to invade, bomb, take out the Iraqi government, and indeed the whole Iraqi establishment, which had horrendous consequences further down, and some blame for the rise of ISIS. Then a number of other hypotheses have been offered. One that always turns up, and which attention is starting to be paid to, I think, is the defense of Israel, which always gets into the mix somehow. And what is the place of that? Some very interesting pieces have started to appear about that. The place of the neocons in promoting and encouraging the attack on Iraq and the subsequent catastrophe there for the USA. Leading up to the war, the American elite, the president, the Secretary of State, others of the top people made a number of statements. The Center for Public Integrity has compiled a list of 935 false statements concerning Iraq that were made between September 11th, 2001 and September 11th, 2003. President Bush made 232 of those false statements about the weapons of mass destruction, and 28 concerning Al-Qaeda and its supposed link to the 9/11 attack. Colin Powell was the runner-up with 244 false statements about the weapons of mass destruction, and 10 more about the supposed connection between Al-Qaeda and 9/11. So I suppose some people will want to dispute whether they were all really false, and there will be a tendency to turn on the fog machine and say, well, we really can't be sure of a lot of those. And that, of course, is routine. According to Reuters, the Prime Minister of Israel has thanked Secretary of State Kerry for blocking a Middle East nuclear arms ban. The Nuclear Proliferation Treaty of 1970 meets every 4 or 5 years, and their goal is to prevent nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. And they've been advancing that agenda every time they met, but it calls upon all the nations of the Middle East to rid themselves of nuclear weapons, and of course that's intolerable to Israel. So Mr. Netanyahu has thanked John Kerry for blocking any such resolution coming out of their latest meeting, and any call for a nuclear arms ban across the entire Middle East, if it would include Israel. So we're getting another lecture on Israeli exceptionalism and why they are unique, and none of the rules that would apply to other nations should apply to them. This weekend we got a big dose of patriotism because of Memorial Day, and there's a lot of self-pity and moaning going around about how difficult things are for us and the sacrifices that have been made on our behalf and so on. Here's a mailing piece I got from the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. If there ever were a time for you to rally around the men and women of law enforcement, it's right now. I am sure that you share my deep concern that a growing anti-cop, anti-government sentiment in America is influencing weak-minded individuals to launch violent and vicious assaults upon the men and women working to enforce our laws and keep our nation safe. Our nation's police officers are under attack and they need our support. Think about it. In a crime that shocked the conscience of our nation, 2 New York City police officers sitting in a marked patrol car were brutally assassinated on December 20th. Today I'm asking you to honor more than 900,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement officers who go out every day and risk their lives for your safety and protection. I'm asking that you donate as much as your heart allows to the programs that make it safer for those who serve us and to the memorial that pays tribute to those who have died protecting us. So it's the usual message, please send money. And I see that message 30 or 40 times a day, I think, from various political individuals and groups, and it's become kind of irritating, but it goes on endlessly because you begin to realize that what politics and public life in this country is all about. People moaning that they don't have enough money, and please send money for our good cause. So they're all stuff.
Thank you, Ron. Karen, I'd like to go to your Asian comments, but I'd like to comment on what Ron has just said first, and invite you to do the same, and then we'll go to your part. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we're talking about American war making. And Ron, I think that this peculiar debate that's developed among the Republican presidential candidates about Iraq is really an example of the fantastic, in a sense of fantasy, world in which American politics is corrupted. It's corrupted, certainly. It's conducted. But when you say that there was no rational basis for what George Bush the Younger did in 2003 in invading Iraq, that seems to me to make a serious mistake about consistent American policy. There was a perfectly rational basis for what the U.S. did in 2003. The U.S. had good reason for invading Iraq. Iraq has the second largest reserves of oil in the Mideast. Iraq had a government which was biddable by the United States for a long time, that is the regime of Saddam Hussein, and had become increasingly less so. The U.S. had been willing to use the government of Iraq to attack its enemies in Iran and produce a war out of that years before. But what had happened by 2003 is that the U.S. Was not encountering a biddable government in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was not doing what he was supposed to do. The U.S. wanted to increase its control of the Middle East and the oil-producing region of the Middle East, and Iraq looked like a good place to teach a lesson. As the head of the American Enterprise Institute said at the time, every couple of years the U.S. has to pick up one of these crappy little countries in the Middle East and throw it against the wall to show the others that we mean business. This is a perfectly rational, as I say, vicious, but perfectly rational reason that the U.S. invaded Iraq. The U.S. invaded Iraq to increase its long-standing policy of control of the Middle East energy resources. Nothing particularly surprising about that. The only thing surprising about it was that they had to make up a propaganda cover for it. And they did, these outrageous lies about weapons of mass destruction. A great propaganda campaign. But the notion that the U.S. did this, as it were, by mistake, or even the notion the U.S. did it to protect Israel, seemed to me completely to misrepresent what the U.S. had done consistently before 2003 in the Middle East, and indeed what it's done consistently since 2003 in the Middle East. The U.S. has no particular interest in protecting Israel, except that Israel is part of its general system of control of the Middle East, the cop on the block, as the Nixon administration said, a stationary aircraft carrier, as it's been called. The U.S. didn't do something for Israel that it was not, as it were, doing for itself. Israel was the cornerstone, the linchpin of American Middle East control. And so if you say we did it for Israel, what you are actually saying is we did it for the American control of the Middle East, which is the only reason the U.S. Supports Israel. The U.S. has no particular reason in suppressing the Palestinians, except for the fact that the Palestinians are suppressed by Israel as part of their own control. Well, a Palestinian state that did U.S. bidding would be just as acceptable to the U.S. as a non-Palestinian state. So these attempt to investigate, to make up, as it were, irrational reasons for the American invasion seems to me to be to fall in with American propaganda. You can't do that.
Well, this is not the place to debate it. You seem to have a much narrower conception of rationality than I do. To me, one of the necessary conditions of rationality is that your assumptions be true or warranted or sufficiently backed that you can proceed on that basis. And that's flagrantly false in this case.
What? No, wait a minute. What assumptions were untrue or unwarranted? You're saying that the U.S. went into Iraq in 2003 because they had some false, the U.S. government had some false assumptions about what they'd find? What were the false assumptions?
Yeah, well, in the official story that Iraq had all these weapons of mass destruction.
But the official story was a propaganda story because the government, if the government were to state its real reasons for why it wanted to control the Middle East, it would produce the sort of reaction to American policy that the Vietnam War did.
Right, right.
I mean, so long as the Vietnam War was understood was protecting people from the ravages of communism, which was attacking them, then the government had support for what was going on in Vietnam. When Americans began to understand that that wasn't the case, that wasn't the reason the U.S. was in Vietnam, it lost that support. And the people who are running the country are not stupid. They know what the problem is, and their biggest problem is convincing the American people that the tasks that are being done for the purposes of the 1% are actually being done because we're protecting peace, freedom, et cetera, around the world. You're watching Aware on the Air. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we have to divide by, when we're talking about we, I think many of the soldiers and many of the people who supported going into Iraq were under the assumption that there were weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, sure.
They could not conceive of the idea that our government would come out and
Exactly.
actually lie to them. But as far as our government is concerned, I think they knew very well. There's evidence that Colin Powell knew when he even spoke to the UN that they had no weapons of mass destruction. I don't have any documents with me, but I've seen the documents or seen the articles which pinpointed some of the documents that, and even Michael Morrell, who is a former CIA analyst, has been interviewed recently. He actually presents information. That was his job, to present information to the president. And even he agreed that, he knew that our government was lying. And he was actually taken to task by, on MSN, by Chris, what's his last name? Chris, I can't think of his last name.
Kevin, no, it'll come to me in a minute. I know who you mean.
Former
Yes.
Democratic, but I may not have it right. He was taken to task for not speaking out about it. And the gentleman who's written the book on it has said, but it's not my job to speak out. He said, my job is just to deliver the information. I mean, it's pretty appalling, but there's so much going on. I think we should move on and maybe leave this discussion to a further meeting whereby maybe some of us can present.
Did I post that piece about how this Republican debate about the origins of the war is playing among the veterans, especially the wounded ones? It's they don't like the notion that any of the Republicans are saying now it was a mistake.
Well, of course, we know that.
They were injured, they were killed in the name of this
One set of lies, and therefore they don't want to hear another set of lies about it. Yeah.
Well, basically, yeah, they don't want to hear the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't want to hear
understandable.
that they were deliberately sent in on false information.
Yeah, psychologically, of course, they can't admit that what they did and
Because
fought
they
for
really
and died
believed.
for was
Right. Well,
was
right.
false.
I mean, how can any widow out there or
Exactly.
any child who lost a parent, they have a hard time accepting that their life has been destroyed because a parent died based upon false information. And yet, you two gentlemen are historians. You know that time and time again, better than I do, that this has happened over the years in history. Okay, I want to say something now about Memorial Day. And this, I started this last week, questioning how many people died at Pearl Harbor, and that's because I had someone who told me that we didn't attack the homeland and no civilians were killed. Well, that's what they meant, and I was kind of confused. I'm thinking, nobody died at Pearl Harbor. I knew that our ships went down, and of course you corrected my information, which is that, of course, over 2,000 were killed, 2,000 Americans on board ship. And I've since been able to suss out what this person meant was that they were military personnel that died. However, even then I found out that he was completely wrong. Approximately 49 civilians died during the attack on Pearl Harbor, although 37 of them were killed by friendly fire. You know, I mean, so if even 12 civilians were targeted, that's too many. The point is that they were attacking the military installations. And as a result, during the war, I mean, the Japanese did not incur as many deaths, quite frankly, as, say, the Dutch East Indies, Poland, Germany, China. China incurred something like 15 million deaths during World War II. The Soviet Union, 25 million, it's much more. Now, I may not have the most accurate data, and anybody can dispute my data, so I'm giving approximates that I was able to find online. But a total of 60 million people died during World War II alone. But back to this, after we attacked Japan, and we know now, in hindsight, that of course it wasn't, there are books written on this, it was not to end the war. But that we killed, first they said there was something like 60 to 80,000 Japanese civilians. were literally instantly killed, and many of them were just vaporized. So even that data isn't absolutely accurate due to the high intense heat. But the final death toll of Hiroshima was 135,000, and Nagasaki was something like 225,000. So, and I kept going through this and looking up, and then I got to Vietnam, and over 58,000 Americans died between the years 54 to 75, or 1.5 to 3.6 million people. Supposedly includes both civilian and military in North and South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. I even question that because I think that there were far more people that were killed in Cambodia that have been attributed to the Khmer Rouge, and so those figures aren't there. So a lot of this data isn't totally accurate. Supposedly, among our allies, South Korea suffered the most. There was something like 4,407. Anyway, but I've still got a lot more data here, but who cares? I think I found myself on total war. I just couldn't handle it anymore. When you think of the sheer huge numbers of people who died, and it doesn't even include just the wounded or the lives destroyed, the families destroyed as a result. So then I want to move on and point out that at least 500,000 Iraqis, over 70% were civilians, okay, died due to our invasion. Almost 6,000 or over 6,000 U.S. soldiers were killed in Iraq, 2,345 in Afghanistan, and these may not be the most up-to-date or accurate, but at least 1 million were wounded in both wars. So, I mean, it just gets down to war has always been the greatest evil, and even if you go back and you look at the Civil War, I mean, the sheer numbers of people who died in the Civil War, when you look at the population at that time, it was the percentage of the population, it was just horrendous. So to me, Memorial Day, you know, we're out there, are we celebrating? No, we're mourning the loss of life and the deaths and the casualties. And I think we really have to look at prevention. We have to look at how horrible war is and prevention. And so now I want to pivot to Asia and say that days after, okay, CNN joined a P-8A Poseidon surveillance aircraft over a Chinese administrated islet in the South China Sea, it's clear that it was a calculated provocation aimed at ramping up pressure on China. This only happened a couple days ago, okay? U.S. officials exploited the reportage to underline Washington's determination to challenge China's territorial claims in these very strategic waters, regardless of the consequences. So in spite of the Silk Railroad, which I talk about all the time, giving an alternative to the shipping lanes through the South China Sea, or the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, but with an ability to then avoid the Malacca Straits, they still use these territorial waters. And not only will they continue, the U.S., they may even now breach what's known as the 12-mile territorial limit around Chinese islets and reefs. And we began this assertion in 2010. That was when we began our pivot to Asia. And what's so hideous about this is, one, the fact that they invited CNN. Here we are again, what we call the embedded media, okay, just like we did in Iraq, just like we've done in Afghanistan. And it was actually out there on CNN. But the fact that they're talking now, the U.S. has actually come out and made the statement that they're going to continue, and they refuse to recognize the China rights to this area or to these islets, or even the 12-mile limit. But they don't mention the fact that Vietnam, the Philippines, they have 12-mile limits around their territory. The U.S. doesn't have a problem with that. So they were warned by Chinese aircraft, and the assumption is that now that the U.S. is counting on what I call Chinese sensibilities to back off and not be militaristic or take their aggression as tantamount to starting war. It's hard for me to believe, and it's true, the Chinese have always backed away from war. That's why I keep saying, you know, our aggression with China is so foolish. They are a nuclear power. They have every right to the waters. I mean, they're called the South China Sea. It's called the South China Sea for a reason. It's right there. And these so-called disputed islands, I mean, at least one of them, the most important one that supposedly the U.S. backs Japan's claim to, the U.S. just gave it to Japan right after the war. We just took it from China and gave it to Japan. I mean, it's so obvious what we're doing. The remilitarization of Japan. This is also something that, while you do have a very militaristic political power in place under the Abe government, and they do have support, and anyone, my Japanese professors, when I studied in Japan a long time ago, were concerned about that. They said, we never want to remilitarize Japan because you have this cult that would definitely, but you also have a lot of Japanese people who remember what took place and are opposing it. And so you do have a lot of peace advocates. So, you know, be sure when we talk about these nations and the things that we're doing, we recognize that these governments do not necessarily support do not necessarily have the support of their populations. So I think it's very important to understand the U.S. is supported by Singapore, Taiwan, and Malaysia as well. And the Philippines is their weak link, which is very sad because the people there are very, very poor. And I talked about Aquino, the President Aquino of the Philippines. I talked about that problem that they had about a month, or it was a couple months ago, and I said that I think that the people now will know that the U.S. cannot be trusted. I mean, the allies. I didn't mean us people because there's been no mention of it here. But I think that some of their allies, some of our so-called allies, surely are able to see. And keep in mind that China is a very major player. They're doing business with all of these Asian nations, and they do have ties with these nations. So what's going to happen when some of these nations decide it's really in their best interest to support China against the U.S.? So we're looking at very serious issues here. And to me, preventing war is the most important thing we can possibly do to support people who otherwise will be murdered and killed by
Do you think
governments.
we're building toward armed conflict in the South China Sea concerning those islands?
Well, that's certainly what we're doing. We're certainly provoking war, but we're acting, Washington, according to James Bradley, Pepe Escobar, people who are what I call China watchers as well. There are many others out there. James Bradley made the statement that Washington doesn't understand Beijing's thinking. Well, I'm not so sure I agree with that. I think they do understand Beijing's thinking. They just don't care about Beijing's thinking. And a name of a Professor Wan Zhi was mentioned as somebody who is an expert on the situation and should be listened to, but I don't think the West is listening to them. See, what the U.S. wants is what they call multilateral decision regarding what's going on in China and the South China Seas. There's a gnat in here. China wants it to be bilateral as the largest power with all the other little nations around them. U.S. wants it to be multilateral because we feel we are in control politically of many of these nations. That's what we've been working towards for a very long time. And actually there is writing now and documents to show that we actually started this plan back before World War II, before the Japanese invasion of China. So but we're reaching, and as I said, I think that since China's been around for centuries, okay, they're not going to allow this nation, we're what, 300, close to 300 years old, because dictate to them how things are to be run in their neighborhood. So I think that's the reality, and counting on China's sensibilities, I think is we're provoking a tiger, literally. And
Well, what makes it dangerous is we're playing chicken with them in
Yeah.
the South China Sea.
Yeah.
They have these islands, uninhabited little islands
Mm-hmm.
there that they're claiming as part of China, apparently. And according to what I've read, they're building additional islands.
They
They're
are.
dumping stuff
Yes, yes.
in the sea.
Right,
And,
which we object to.
creating more islands there.
Except we
And-
don't object to other nations in Southeast Asian area to building, or in Asia. We don't object to their building little islets. We only object to China's building these islets.
So
Because
the U.S.
China
is
a
overflying
competitor-
those
a
islands.
competitor to the U.S., and
Right.
the other nations are not. The other
Right.
nations are essentially coordinated into the American control of the
Exactly.
region.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're overflying those islands for surveillance, and the Chinese are saying you can't do that. And where will it lead?
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. I'll be very frank. I think it's a false flag about to occur. I really see, I mean, a buildup to having one of our planes, one of our surveillance planes shot down. The CNN crew was never in any danger because that was just an initial provocation. But what's the next provocation going to accomplish? And once we intrude in that 12-mile radius, then what's going to happen?
Yeah, they're already starting the line. You're invading our airspace.
Which, of course, we are.
We are.
It happens to be
We
true.
are.
It makes a difference.
Exactly.
Near where I used to live in Massachusetts, in a place called Milton, Massachusetts, there's a museum, very small museum, which actually very nice museum, very interesting stuff. It's called the Museum of the China Trade. And if you go to this museum, what you find there is that there are artifacts having to do with the economic exploitation of China by Massachusetts merchants and sailors from the 19th century, from well before the First World War. And what this points up is that American foreign policy, U.S. government foreign policy, even before the 20th century, was concerned with the economic exploitation of China. I mean, I think Karen's quite right to point out that in many ways the Second World War in the Pacific was a conflict between Japan and the U.S. over who would control essentially the Chinese economy. Americans had effectively controlled it since the so-called open door policy that the U.S. followed in the late 19th century. Open door meant that China was to be open to economic exploitation by all comers, mainly the imperialist powers of Western Europe and mainly the United States. Any attempt to exclude the United States from the China trade would be met with arms by the U.S. The U.S. was clear about this. And what happened was, with the redevelopment of Japan in the 20th century, was that Japan was moving in on this economic control of East Asia that the U.S. had counted on literally for generations, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor is usually where Americans begin the account of the Second World War in the Pacific, and of course the real history extends far back, long before that. And the competition over who would control the East Asian economy continues to this day. That's what's at stake between the U.S. and China, and the notion that, well, it's a question between bilateralism and multilateralism or something of that sort, on examination, reduces to the extent to whether China will be able to control its economic region or whether the U.S. will. This is not new, but it is, as you both suggest, extremely dangerous because of what the U.S. is willing to do to control that region. If the U.S. were, in fact, to withdraw its military involvement in East Asia and let the states of the region work out whatever arrangement they want to, a system that sounds awfully similar to what would happen in Southwest Asia as well, what should happen in Southwest Asia as well. These problems would be a little less obvious. We begin in this country, when we talk about foreign policy, with the notion that we own the world, that the U.S. ruling class owns the world, the U.S. 1% owns the world, and anybody who tries to disturb that is somehow making trouble. The notion that China is making trouble over the South China Sea is true to the extent that that China is insisting that the U.S. 1% does not control this region, that they do. And that, indeed, is extremely dangerous. You're listening to Aware on the Air.
Well,
further comments?
Yeah, this argument has developed over, must we cast aside the notion of spheres of influence, for example? And
the U.S. certainly doesn't think so.
Right, right. We insist upon ours, but
Right.
no one else is allowed to claim one. Not Russia, not China,
Exactly.
not anyone else.
Exactly.
It's curious.
And this isn't new. I mean, think about the Monroe Doctrine that you learned about in American history. I mean, what was the Monroe Doctrine after all? The Monroe Doctrine was a statement that the U.S. would be the major power in the Western Hemisphere, and that other powers, other modern powers of that time, were not to interfere. That's incredible. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. We have this fantasy of the U.S. sort of accidentally ending up in this position. It wasn't an accident at all. I mean, our so-called founding fathers referred to the American empire, and by that they meant the extension of our sphere of influence. Washington says this, Jefferson says this. These are people who understand that the commercial empire that is the United States of America is expansionary and will indeed include its sphere of influence. That hasn't changed. The circumstances, those explicit circumstances they had, those have changed, and it's for us to recognize them today and not collapse into American propaganda on the matter. The reason we do this program, eh?
I think
On Memorial Day, I thought the most dangerous comment that we got from the Memorial Day speechifying, where we remember all those people who were killed as a result of American wars, particularly Americans, as we remember them, the most dangerous part of that remembrance is the notion that these people died for freedom, died for peace, died for democracy, because of course the U.S. is always fighting for peace, freedom, and democracy, and when people kill American soldiers, it's because they're against peace, freedom, and democracy. And that's taken for granted. You can't even raise that as a question in these Memorial Day celebrations when the sacrifice of American soldiers is invoked. It is always with the notion that the sacrifice was for these higher purposes. In fact, the sacrifice was almost in every case for the higher purpose of the control of the world economy by the American ruling class. And this is the scandal of things like Memorial Day.
Right, right. I want to quote Pepe Escobar when he made the comment that what people have to realize is that China centuries ago they were wearing silk and reading books, while France, for example, was digging roots, I mean. And so they went dormant for quite a while, primarily because of the elite control, but they're rising again. And Deng Xiaoping's recommendations at the time after Tiananmen that we keep a low profile, he said that isn't going to be the case anymore. But as I keep saying, still, they are not being they're not attacking anyone. They're not invading anyone. 1979, they invaded Vietnam. That didn't work out, and but they haven't done any invasions since then. And compare that to our record of invasions. They come out on top But they have the military weapons, they have the expertise, just as Russia does. So we are playing with fire, we really are. Oh, by the way, does anyone see any color revolutions taking place in Macedonia now? Does anyone have an opinion on that?
No, I don't know anything about what's going
Yeah,
on there. I
yeah.
did want to note, if there was time, the curious election results, the leftward jolts in Spain.
Yep.
Oh,
and
yes, yes.
Alberta, Canada, of all places.
Yes, yes. The Green Party in
That's
Alberta,
amazing, yeah.
right, and other leftists. Oh, definitely, yeah.
These are very important. In some ways, they may be the most important political
Right.
results. And if understood correctly, it seems to me the British election falls into the same pattern. There's been a lot of attempt to say, well, the British election is a triumph for the right in Britain. I think that's not true for reasons that become clear if you look at what actually was at stake in the British election. And the same thing is, in a sense, being played out in Spain and even in Canada, remarkably enough, as you say. I'd also like to mention a vote. It wasn't an election, but a vote occurring here in Illinois that may be one of the most shocking political moves by the Illinois legislature in some time, and that's saying something after all. I'm referring to the fact that last week the Illinois legislature passed something called Senate Bill 1761. It's a standard designation in the legislature for various measures. But this was a peculiar measure because it had, of course, something to do with Illinois, but it also had something to do with foreign policy. The Illinois legislature is not usually in the business of working on foreign policy, but in this matter they were, and they were for a particular reason. What the Senate Bill 1761, which passed both houses of the Illinois legislature, and the governor said he was avid to sign, what this measure did was prevent any monies by the state to be spent by the state of Illinois, and by monies they were thinking particularly of pension funds, all those monies that we've been having so much trouble about in the courts in Illinois. It prevented any of that money to be invested in companies that were boycotting apartheid in Israel. In other words, any companies that were part of a program against Israeli racism, those companies were not to be invested in by Illinois pension funds and similar things. In other words, Senate Bill 1761 supported Israeli racism, Israeli apartheid. It's astonishing on the face of it that Illinois should be developing a foreign policy in this regard, but particularly this foreign policy, a support for racism. It gets worse. Our representatives from this area in the Illinois legislature, Representative Carol Amons in the House and Senator Scott Bennett in the Senate, neither of them voted against this resolution in favor of Israeli racism. That's just mind-boggling. There were, in fact, no votes against this measure in either the House or the Senate. And I think for the most part that suggests how little most of the members of the House and the Senate really knew about this, and in a sense how little they cared about it. But there were a handful of refusals to vote on the matter, people who voted present or excused themselves. Representative Ammons and Senator Bennett were recorded as not voting on the matter. In other words, they didn't vote against it. And I think there should be some difficulty about this. If, say, a generation ago, a measure supporting racism in South Africa had come before the legislature, a measure supporting South African apartheid, we would be concerned if our representatives didn't vote against it. But that's what we've got in regard to this issue in regard to Israel. Comments?
Has anyone heard their rationales for this yet?
They've been asked, and as far as I know, I mean, I wrote letters for one thing, but many other people did too. They've been asked, and I have heard of no comment from either one, either explaining or apologizing for these wretched votes. I would be happy to hear something about it, but as I say, it seems to be silence as the way in which it's being treated by these representatives.
Did anyone see last night on local television, Channel 12, PBS, the story, the 2-hour movie, The Home Front?
No, tell me about it.
Military families. It was mostly, to me, a kind of PBS semi-official propaganda. It was a lot like a recruiting film for the military. This says more than 2 million men and women serve in America's all-volunteer military force, and another 3 million are their husbands, wives, sons, and daughters. The Home Front uses unprecedented access to soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen to create a documentary of intimate portraits of America's military families. So it was all about how difficult life is for them, how hard it is to live with your partner or son or daughter fighting overseas, being deployed. The word deployment was used dozens of times.
But no question of why the fighting was going on and why these people were deployed.
Right,
Is that right?
Right.
That was taken for granted.
Yeah. So we were supposed to understand how difficult their life was, how it's disrupting their lives, and especially the returning soldiers. It destroyed the marriages of some of them, apparently, and so on. Some of them have PTSD, a lot of suicides and so on. All these things are mentioned, but the overall tone and direction of the thing was the benevolence of the military in providing training and money for education and on, how they look after their own and so on. So it was quite amazing.
And the questions of why these military personnel were doing what they were doing abroad and why they were, as a result, having this very real, I'm sure, very real problems that we'd discuss. The question of why they're doing it. Why are they going across the country, across the ocean and killing people? That didn't come up.
No.
Well, one woman I spoke to recently who's totally opposed to militarization has 2 grandsons in the military. One because he couldn't find a job and he had student debt. So he felt that was the only option. And the other simply, it was to get an education, to have his education paid for. So, these are not good reasons. But unfortunately, it's hard to talk someone out of it. Yes.
It's been called the economic draft.
But
Well, with our program of austerity, it's forcing some people in it. But on the other hand, we know that we pay out millions to these, I call them contractors. There's more than just Blackwater mercenaries that are out there under Academy, I think is their new name. There are a lot of what we call privatized soldiers or mercenaries, and they're being well paid, very well paid. So we don't need a draft. We've got people being paid, huge amounts to go and kill and be killed.
The New York Times this morning had an extraordinary article claiming the U.S. is being hampered in its war against ISIS. You might ask, U.S. war against ISIS, what's that all about? U.S. is being, but the New York Times headlined that the U.S. war against ISIS is being hampered for, and you have to read this to believe that, because the U.S. has an extreme, even excessive concern for civilians. Quote, American officials say they are not striking significant and obvious Islamic State targets out of fear that the attacks will accidentally kill civilians.
This
is the New York Times. This is the New York Times explaining what's going on in regard to the Islamic State. The Islamic State being the Sunni backed or the Sunni-based insurgency in Iraq and Syria. This is quite amazing. When President Obama began bombing Syria, which he did, it became the 7th predominantly Muslim country to be bombed during his Nobel Peace Prize presidency. George Bush only bombed 5. That militarism has killed countless innocent people and poses all sorts of serious moral and strategic questions. It's simply inexcusable to whitewash all of that and ignore significant specific evidence of civilian deaths in the anti-ISIS campaign while claiming to report on and clearly complain about American restraint. But that's what the New York Times is doing. Now, in a propaganda regime like this, the U.S. government doesn't have to worry too much about covering sin with smooth names, as it does consistently throughout the Middle East and indeed elsewhere.
That comes up in every war. As I recall, during Vietnam and the earlier assaults on Iraq, there were a lot of complaints from the military about we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back.
Right.
And we are facing too many restrictions. That's why we didn't win. And we should be allowed to go in with our biggest weapons and wipe them all out immediately.
Well, my document here says over 70% of the 500,000 people in Iraq that were killed were civilians. And it's not easy to
I would
get
say,
this
yeah, and
information.
that's fairly arbitrary to begin with.
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
first
it
of
is.
all,
It's probably
the
higher.
invasion of Iraq, I mean,
It's probably higher, yes.
it doesn't suggest that the U.S. had a right to invade Iraq and kill anyone. They didn't. There was no justification for that, and for the U.S. to say, well, most of the people we killed were military, or even a large fraction of the people we killed were
Ridiculous.
military, that means nothing.
Right,
That has
right.
to do with the fact that the U.S. doesn't feel it has to give a justification for its war. It's clear that we're fighting for peace, freedom, and justice. Therefore, why can questions be raised? You've been watching AWARE on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 22nd week of 2015. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. A nice note about that, I saw this morning that American police killed more people in the month of March than British police have killed throughout the 20th century. That's impressive. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him, also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Congratulations to Jason and his colleagues for winning 2 awards from the Alliance for Community Media. And see the Facebook page for AWARE for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans often don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the others who've been persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bai, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.